Hey guys, so we're going to be looking at the fighting aspect of the American Revolution. Make sure you read the notes on this. When talking about the war, coming into the fighting before it even started, on paper, the British had all the advantages and everyone in the world was sure the British were going to win. British had a strong, stable government, which the colonists did not. British had the best financial system in the world, and of course, wars are very, very expensive. The colonists had no financial system, no banks, and no money. And the British will have one of the best militaries in the entire world. They'll have some of the best trained soldiers. They'll have 30,000 Hessians. That's a German mercenary. 25,000 loyalists, or people that's colonists that stayed with England. 20,000 freed slaves will fight with the British. And most importantly, they had the biggest and best navy in the entire world. The colonists had a huge disadvantage when it came to the military. The Continental Army, the official army led by George Washington, varied wildly. At the most, it had 35,000. At the very least, at Valley Forge, it will have 3,000. And people just kept coming and going. So it's almost impossible to get an exact number of how big the Continental Army was at any time. They relied on state militia, who were incredibly unreliable. Washington would be going from New Jersey to New York, and the state militia for New Jersey would refuse to follow him because they would only stay in their state. State militia were incredibly unreliable, and it had a very small navy. So what happened? How did the British lose this then? Some people have called the American Revolution and the colonist victory a miracle. Is this a miracle? Is this because the colonists were just so much better fighters? And was it the hand of God? The way to understand militaries, or the way to understand wars, isn't by looking at just the military and the size of the military and the strength of the military. There are two other things that are really important. One, it's called logistics. Detailed coordination of complex operations involving people, supplies, and facilities. Logistics are less interesting than the fighting or the battles, but logistics are what wins wars long term. This involves, like, how do you get troops to the battlefield? How do you get supplies to your troops? Where are your troops going to sleep and stay? It's the long-term things that usually determine the winner or the loser. And when it came to the logistics of the American Revolution, the British had all the disadvantages. First, geography. Not only, well, I should say, before we even get to geography, England's biggest disadvantage was they were in a huge amount of debt. Remember, the whole American Revolution started because England had gotten in debt from a previous war, the French and Indian War. Now they're about to go into another war. It's going to last 8 years, and it's going to be insanely expensive. They're already taxing their people to death to pay for the last war, and now they're just jumping into another one. So besides the debt, they also had to face geography. America is about 3,000 miles away from England. So just to get troops, supplies, just to get messages over to the battlefield, over to America, it took about 3 months. Not only that, as I've said before, and I'll say many times again, what will become the United States is enormous geographically. The battlefield we are talking about here stretches from Florida up to Canada and from the Atlantic to the Mississippi River. When you take the geographic size of the battlefield we're talking about here, that huge military, 56,000 soldiers, that's not nearly enough. That is a tiny amount of people for a battlefield this big. So in terms of geography, the British had all the disadvantages. In terms of the supplies, the British also had the disadvantages. Normally, when England goes to war, it gets its supplies, including a lot of soldiers, from the colonists. Well, now they're fighting the colonists in America, so they can't rely on them for supplies. Also, America doesn't have transportation system. It doesn't have roads. So getting supplies through America to its soldiers will be a huge pain for the British. The British will lose two battles, two of the most important battles, Saratoga and Yorktown, partly because they could not get supplies to their men. Third, a strategic target. In European wars, if the British are fighting the French, all the British have to do is capture Paris, the capital, and the French will surrender. If any country captured London, the capital of England, then England would surrender. That's how European wars worked. If you capture the capital, it's over. Well, what's the strategic target in America? There is none. Because we're essentially talking about 13 separate colonies that will become states, and none of them are the center. So Philadelphia was at first the unofficial capital, but the British took Philadelphia, and then the colonists just moved. British will take all the major cities. They'll take New York, they'll take Boston, Philadelphia, Charleston, and every time they take a city, they think, hey, we won, and then the colonists just keep fighting. Because America, at this time, is essentially a third world country. So the British never have a strategic target that they can take and just win the war. Finally, there were divisions in England. There were a lot of people in England that had no interest in going to war and opposed the war from the very beginning. This is important because there are already a lot of people that didn't want to go to war. That means the longer the war goes on, the more expensive it gets, the more the people in England have to be taxed, the more they'll turn against it. And when a majority of people in England turn against the war, then the government will have to stop fighting. Because, again, they'll put so much pressure on Parliament, and Parliament will eventually say, all right, we've had enough. Divisions in England were a huge problem. Because a lot of people in England, they didn't want their taxes to be raised anymore, and when you go to war, you have to raise taxes. But also, some of them just said, I don't want to kill fellow Englishmen, because they considered the colonists Englishmen. So that's part of the reason England will have to rely on German mercenaries, those Hessians, because they cannot get enough support in England. A lot of the best generals they had refused to be a part of this. So England had all of the logistical disadvantages. Now, the most important disadvantage England had, and the most important thing to look at whenever you're looking at war, is the military objective. What is the objective? What is England's objective here? Is it to kill all the colonists? No, of course not. They just want to put down the rebellious part of the population. This is what's called a counterinsurgency. And make sure you read about this in the notes. A counterinsurgency, it can be abbreviated as COIN, C-O-I-N. If this sounds familiar, this is the U.S. strategy in Iraq and Afghanistan. the policy was created by David Petraeus. That is what we were doing in Iraq and Afghanistan, a counterinsurgency. That means you're not trying to fight everyone. You're trying to put down a part of the population that is rebelling against you. It's also what the United States policy in Vietnam was. Putting down an internal rebellion or an internal insurrection. So what does that mean exactly for the British? The British will have to do two very specific things in order to win a counterinsurgency. First, they will have to capture and destroy the Continental Army led by George Washington, because that is the manifestation of the rebellion. George Washington and his army, they will have to catch it. If as long as that's alive, they can't say they put down the rebellion. Is that a doable task? Yes, they never will accomplish it. They get very, very close several times, but that's doable. The second objective in a counterinsurgency is to convince all of the colonists, everyone in this entire place, to not rebel anymore and to want to be part of the British Empire. Is that doable? No. It is virtually, it is doable, it is virtually impossible. You cannot force someone to think the way you want them to. This part is really difficult because in order to convince everyone in America they want to be part of the British Empire, there's two things, there's only two ways to do that. One, they could just destroy their will to resist and, kill as many people as they can and destroy as many cities until the colonists just give up. Make the colonists' life as miserable as they can, but that's not realistic. The British don't have enough soldiers to conquer this entire area. The other way to do that is to win the hearts and minds. Make the colonists love the British so much that the colonists don't want to fight against them. That is what the United States tried to do in Iraq and Afghanistan. That's why most of the money was spent building up roads, building up bridges, building schools, power plants, stuff to make the people's lives in Iraq and Afghanistan better, so they would love the United States. It didn't work, but that is the only way you can win a counterinsurgency. And it's that second point, convincing the population that they want to like you. That is the one that's so difficult because you cannot convince people to do exactly what you want. It's just impossible. That's why counterinsurgencies are so incredibly difficult. Again, on paper, it looked like the British had all the advantages going into the war. But are there any other examples of a major world power being defeated by a third world country in a counterinsurgency? Yes, the French in Vietnam, the United States in Vietnam, the Soviet Union in Afghanistan in the 1980s, the United States in Iraq, the United States in Afghanistan. All of those are an example of a world power being defeated by a third world country. So this has happened many times in history. Counterinsurgencies are just difficult, and that is the most important thing to look at when you're looking at war. What is the military objective? So England's military objective is near impossible. What is the colonists' objective? Do the colonists have to defeat the British in battle? Do they have to destroy every British ship and every British sailor? No. All the colonists have to do is just drag out the war for as long as it can go, because the longer the war goes, the more expensive it is for the people in England, the more taxes are going to be raised, and eventually enough people in England will say, oh, fine, just give it to them. We don't want to do this anymore. So all Washington has to do to win the war is to not lose. It's called a prolonged war of attrition and exhaustion. Drag out the war as long as you possibly can, because wars are just insanely expensive. That is why Washington was the right man, the right place at the right time. Washington, he is the perfect person to be general of the Continental Army because he understood what had to be done. He understood he didn't have to defeat the British in every battle. And so he wouldn't even try to do that. Here's a fun fact for you. Washington, he will lose more battles than any other military general in U.S. history that was successful at the war. In all U.S. history, in every war that the United States has been successful at, including this one, he lost more battles than any other general. Because he will lose most of the battles. He'll just win the war. Washington, we will talk about him a lot more. He's interesting because he was obsessed with abstract ideas of honor, duty, and responsibility. All his writings, he always obsessed about those things. And so he'll realize early on he is not a great general. He is not better than any of the British generals. He's not smarter than anyone, and he has less resources, so he will not try to fight them. Just a couple things about Lincoln. A couple things about Washington. He, besides being obsessed with those abstract ideas of honor, responsibility, and duty, he was also just obsessed with looking like a president. And he was obsessed with being self-controlled all the time. He was insanely tall for his time. He was like 6'2", and he weighed like over 200 pounds. At the time, he was absolutely massive, about a foot taller than the average American. He was one of the best horseback riders and dancers. He probably, if he were alive today, he would be described as a jock. Because he is not the smartest of all the founding fathers by far. He did not have an education, but he was acutely aware of all of his shortcomings. And so he always maintained a lot of poise and self-control. He would never let anyone see him weak. It's one reason he didn't talk a whole lot is because he had terrible teeth. He was always so self-controlled. All the descriptions of him at the time said he had, quote, good judgment, because he would take a long time to decide what to do so he could make sure he was always doing the right thing, the honorable thing. And he always made sure everyone respected him. And so he was not exactly a friendly guy. No one disrespected him. Everyone always looked up to him. And part of the reason for that, one of the key things about him that we'll talk about more later, is he always stayed above politics. That is really important for anyone, especially someone that's president. He always stayed above politics by keeping people from all political factions around him. That is one of the hallmarks of a good president. Abraham Lincoln will do the same thing, is bring different perspectives in the cabinet so that all the different perspectives are represented so he can hear all sides. And so Washington will do that. But the most important thing that Washington does, and this is really important, the reason he is so incredibly impressive is the way he handled power. Washington is given more power than any other American during this period. And he always gave up power after it was bestowed upon him. After the public gave him power, saying that they trusted him, he would always voluntarily give it up. Like after he was made commander-in-chief of the Continental Army, he gave it up. And most people didn't think he would do it, because most people in history, when they control a military, they don't give it up. And there's tons of examples. Santa Anna of Mexico, Kim Jong-un of North Korea, Saddam Hussein, Iraq, Mubarak in Egypt, Saddam Hussein, Joseph Stalin, Adolf Hitler, all of them, when they have control of the military, they never give it up. When Washington ended, when the American Revolution ended, and Washington was going to give up the Continental Army, King George III said, quote, if he actually does that, because King George did not believe he would. He said, if he actually does that, he will be the greatest human alive. And when he gave up control of the military, and eventually he will give up control of the presidency, that is what makes him so impressive, is he never tried to grasp onto more power. That is what makes him the father of this country. And it is, again, one of those things that is just unheard of. And there will be a lot of attempts to make him king of the United States, and he will always turn it down. That's what a great president does. Washington will do 3 specific things that makes him the perfect person to be commander-in-chief of the military during the American Revolution. First and foremost, he runs away. He knew he wasn't a great general, and some of the most impressive things he will do during the war isn't attacking the British or fighting the British. It's times when the British will have him surrounded, and he will find a way to escape with the Continental Army. He was a master of escape. And that may not sound like a lot, but remember, for the military objective, that's all he has to do is escape and run away and stay alive. So his ability to run away and escape British, that is one of his greatest strengths, arguably his greatest strength as a general. Second, he keeps the Continental Army together. There were a lot of times when the Continental Army almost fell apart, and especially Valley Forge, when it got down to like 3,000 men, because the Continental Army, it was getting no money during this period, virtually no money. He'll fund a lot of the army with his own money. But remember, there's no government in America, there's no finances, and so there's no stability. But he will manage to keep it together, the Continental Army together, largely by his personality. He will tell his soldiers, you have to stay, especially at Valley Forge, you have to stay. If not for the cause, do it for me. Because he will sacrifice as much as anyone else for the effort. And a lot of soldiers will stay just because they loved him so much. The third thing he does that is so impressive and so ahead of his time is he vaccinated his soldiers. There was like cholera and yellow fever outbreaks, specifically a yellow fever outbreak outside of New York, and he is one of the first vaccinators. He will force everyone in the military to get vaccinated. Vaccinations back then were terrible too, the way they did it. They would take someone that has yellow fever with all these welts on them, take a needle and just poke one of the welts, get the pus out, and poke it in to soldiers. And the death rate from yellow fever in the military was substantially lower than it was in the civilian population in New York that did not get the vaccinations. It is one of the things that helped keep the military together. So that is why Washington, he is the right man, the right place at the right time. When it comes to a lot of the long-term factors, and especially the military objectives, the colonists actually had the advantages. So it's not a miracle that the British lost and the colonists won. If you look at all of human history and all of the other counterinsurgencies, it would have been a miracle if the British had won this. Now, when the fighting started, both sides will make some very big mistakes. the colonists' mistakes weren't nearly as big. Like one of their mistakes is they will try to conquer Canada. The United States tries to do that in several wars. We'll talk about another one later, where after the war starts, Americans go up to Canada and tell them like, "Hey, we're here to liberate you." People in Canada are just like, no, we're good. We're fine. We'll stay with England. So that's one of the mistakes the British colonists made. But the mistakes the British made were much bigger and much more important. England will make 3 mistakes in particular that will destroy their ability to win. First, they underestimate the colonists. They always underestimate the colonists. They always talked about them so dismissively, about how easy it was going to be to beat them. They say colonists, the Patriots and the Whigs, those are the ones fighting against England. And England always underestimated them. It's probably because England was the world superpower, and it's probably impossible to be the world superpower and not underestimate your enemies. World superpowers always seem to do that, going back to the Romans. Second, in order for the British to win, they have to get more loyalists. They have to get loyalists on their side. And England's second mistake is always overestimating the number of loyalists, the number of people that wanted to stay with England. They always thought it was a huge part of the population that loved them. And in fact, it was never more than like 15% of the population at the most. So British victory depended on loyalists coming out and taking over the fighting for them. Because, again, America's huge, so they're going to need loyalists, and that never happened. For a very obvious reason, there wasn't a lot of them. But especially because of England's third big mistake. And this is the really big one. British actions constantly turned more and more colonists against them. Remember, they're fighting a counterinsurgency. In order for them to win, they have to convince the majority of the population that they want to be part of England. Well, everything England did during the war did the exact opposite. Everything they will do will turn more and more colonists against them. So there's 3 groups of colonists: Patriots, Whigs, which were the majority. Those are the ones fighting against England. And not everyone that was a patriot fought either. There were loyalists and Tories, people in America that wanted to stay with England. That was the minority. That was like 15% of the most. And then there was like 40% that just didn't care. They wanted to be left alone. They wanted to just farm, and it didn't matter to them if they were part of England or not. What England did throughout the entire war will turn more and more people against them. They did not convince colonists that the colonists wanted to be part of England. They will convince more and more loyalists and more people that were completely indifferent to turn into patriots and Whigs, partly because of just treating them bad. If you're a British soldier, or you're a German Hessian especially, can you tell the difference between a patriot and a loyalist? No, they all look exactly the same. You know, if you take over, when they took over New York, they can ask, like, are you a patriot or a loyalist? But obviously everyone's going to say a loyalist. But they all look exactly the same. It's the same problem the United States had in both Vietnam and in Iraq and Afghanistan. In a counterinsurgency, your friends and your enemies, they all look exactly the same. So a lot of soldiers will treat a lot of the colonists terribly, especially the German Hessians, because, again, they're mercenaries. They don't care. And every person that they treat bad they're just creating more and more enemies. The other thing that England will do to turn a lot of colonists against them is, it's called Lord Danmore's Proclamation. England will say any slave that fights with us will get their freedom. This is obviously a huge mistake, because what part of the country is most supportive of England? It has the most loyalists? The South. What is the South's economy totally dependent on? Slavery. So England will, throughout the entire war, throughout the 8 years of the war, they will turn more and more colonists against them as time goes on. And that is why England will lose the war. They will keep making mistakes and they will keep treating colonists worse and worse. I'm not going to, we will not be going into all of the battle because all of the battles are not equally important. The two that are the most important, the two that you have to know are, one, Saratoga. This is called the diplomatic turning point of the American Revolution. Diplomacy means foreign policy. If the colonists are going to win, they need assistance. And who did they go to for assistance? France. Not because the French liked the colonists, but because the French hated the British. So, the Americans kept going to the French and saying, we need military alliance, and the French wouldn't do it until they had some indication that the Americans could win. And that's why the Battle of Saratoga was so important. The British will get themselves in a situation where they cannot get more supplies, and the Americans have a victory. And because of that, America's diplomat in France, Benjamin Franklin, said, we can win this as long as you give us an alliance. And that is what will lead to the French alliance, and make sure you know this. The French alliance is a permanent military alliance. That means an attack on one, if one side is attacked, the other side will come to their defense. And you must know that this is a permanent military alliance, because a lot of alliances are just for the duration of a war. This is a permanent one, which means the United States and France will be allied even after the war. And this will come back up in a major way later, so make sure you know this. So England and the United States and France will have a permanent military alliance, and it will come back. But it's because of this alliance that the colonists were able to defeat the British. French now were supplying troops, ships, supplies, and money, and it will come to, the benefits of it will come to fruition at the final battle of the American Revolution at a place called Yorktown. British, under a guy named Lord Cornwallis, got themselves trapped at a place called Yorktown. Normally, British ships just come up and pick them up or bring them supplies, but a French fleet happened to defeat the British, and so Cornwallis and his men were trapped in Yorktown with Washington and 16,000 man force of Americans and French surrounding him on one side and French ships on the other side bombarding him. He ended up having to surrender. Cornwallis and 8,000 men, 8,000 of the best British soldiers had to surrender. And when they did that, it was a huge victory for the United States and a major defeat for England. Could England still fight at this point? Yes. England, it can still fight if it wants to, but by this time, the people in England were so sick of the war, it had been so expensive, and they had been told so many times that, oh, we're about to win, that when the British lost at Yorktown, the majority of people in England said, we give up. We don't want to do this anymore. And they put pressure on Parliament, and it is the last major battle of the American Revolution before the Treaty of Paris. The Treaty of Paris officially ended the American Revolution. That's why there's the Treaty of Paris 1763 that ended the French and Indian War. The Treaty of Paris 1783 will end the American Revolution. It did a lot of things. Most importantly, make sure you read about it in your notes. Most importantly, it ended the American Revolution, and the British acknowledged the colonists were independent. And two, it gave the colonists all the territory north to Canada, south to Florida, and west to the Mississippi River. The amount of land the colonists got here was equivalent to roughly France, England, and Germany combined. So this is a huge, huge victory. So just to summarize this, how can we understand the colonists' victory, the Americans' victory during this war? Was it a matter of, was it a miracle? No, it wasn't a miracle in any way, shape, or form. Were the colonists just better fighters? Something you'll commonly hear is they fought like Native Americans, and they used guerrilla tactics, and that is factually incorrect. That did not happen. I mean, it happened a few times, but that is not why they won. When they did win, it's because the battles they did win, they didn't use guerrilla tactics. Washington wasn't great because he won a lot of battles, because he only won about 3 and lost the majority of them. He was the perfect person because he understood the nature of the conflict and he kept the Continental Army together. Most importantly, though, why did the colonists win? It's because the British failed at their objectives. They had 2 objectives, and they failed at both of them. They never caught the Continental Army and put it down, and they did not convince any Americans that they wanted to be part of the British Empire. They just turned more and more Americans against them. So it is not accurate to say the colonists, or to say the Americans won because of their brilliance. The Americans won because the British failed at their objectives. Counterinsurgencies are just really difficult, and there's more examples of, well, there are just a lot of examples of a world power being defeated by a third world country in a counterinsurgency. Now, we'll come back to this later, but there's one counterinsurgency in U.S. history in which the United States will be successful: the Civil War. How was the United States successful at that counterinsurgency? Because that is an internal rebellion, technically. We'll get to that at the end of the semester. I hope everyone's doing well. Make sure you read the notes on the American Revolution, and let me know if you have any questions.